Thank you for joining us. I am Reşat Kasaba. I am the director of the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this conversation on European response to COVID. Before we start, I want to thank some of our partner organizations who have helped us put this program together. Henry M. Jackson Foundation, Center for Global Studies, and Center for West European Studies have contributed in different ways, and we're grateful to them for their support. We have a very distinguished guest with us today to lead this discussion. Enrico Letta is currently the Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs, which is a part of Sciences Po in Paris. He is also the president of the Jacques Delors Institute and currently serving as the president of Association of Professional Schools of International Affairs. Mr. Letta has served in very prominent positions, both in Italian government and also in the European Union. In addition to serving as minister, cabinet minister in Italy, he was also prime minister in that country, and he was a member of the Italian parliament and also member of the European Parliament. So I cannot imagine someone who could be more qualified to lead us in this discussion on European response to COVID. Thank you, Mr. Letta. Thank you for being with us. I want to also tell our audience that as you follow the conversation, you can enter your questions by using the chat function. And we will gather those, and towards the end of this program, we will have some time to answer at least some of those questions. So feel free to write them as we move forward. So I do want to start by touching on a few topics and asking some questions. First of all, I just want to kind of see how this all appeared to you in Paris. You've served in some high positions in Italian and European Union politics. I know that you follow those contexts very well. So you have a very unique vantage point, and I'm really interested in your take on both the Italian and the French response to the crisis. So.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm very pleased to be here. I'm very happy, and at the same time, I'm very sad because I was supposed to be physically in Seattle today just to have this conversation together, and of course on a different matter, but we decided to change the tools and to change also the topics. And I'm very glad to be with you, Reşat. You are my predecessor as president of APSIA, the World Association of University School of International Affairs, and our friendship was one of the best achievements in my last period. So thank you very much for your friendship and for this invitation. In reality, in Europe, in the European Union, we had a very strange approach to the crisis, because the crisis affected one country at the very beginning, and this country was Italy. And the crisis affected one part of the country, northern part of Italy. So the first reaction was around the Italian decisions and the northern part of Italy decisions. And I remember very well that it was the final days of February, there was a lot of skepticism in the rest of Europe about the very tough decisions we took in Italy. And this skepticism was also because in Europe it was supposed to be very complicated to apply strict restrictions and to say how to oblige people not to be in the streets or be obliged people to stay at home. And it was a sort of constraint of freedom that was considered as incompatible with the values, European values. So I have to say that at the very beginning, I was a little bit shocked by the rise of skepticism around the Italian decisions, because Italy was the first country affected, and so Italy was the country who took at the very beginning, very tough decisions. And in France, in Germany, in Spain, of course, in London, those decisions were considered at the very beginning as too far, too much, impossible to take in Paris or in London, in Madrid, in Berlin. So when I saw exactly the same approach, the same protocol applied in those countries just 10 days later, at the same level, in Germany, they took a different approach. They had a little bit different approach, but in Spain and France, they applied almost the same framework that we decided to apply in Italy. So I was surprised, but it seemed to be also the demonstration of the strength and the violence of this virus. And the fact also that in Europe you have a lot of borders, very close borders, very close capitals, so it is not easy to divide the different countries. And the most important point is the fact that the European Union has many competences, big power, a lot of money, no competence on healthcare. So that was a big contradiction, because at the very beginning, people started to ask, but what the European Union is doing for this crisis? And it was impossible for the European Union to act at the very beginning because of this lack of competences. And this lack of competences was due to the fact that in the past, first of all, the UK, the Great Britain, wanted to always veto any further accomplishment of the European integration in social affairs and in sanitary policies, healthcare policies. So at the very beginning, we had also this other contradiction. But then, and second part of March, all the continental Europe, or almost all continental Europe, was with the same approach. And now Italy is the first country reopening. And for instance, Spain and France are waiting the result of the Italian reopening, because it is, at the end of the day, a problem of sequence, of effectiveness, of facts, of experience. The experience is very important. And Italy played as the experience country, the test country. And of course, that was useful for the rest of Europe. That was very complicated for us. But for us, the most complicated part for Italy, the most complicated part was the fact that in Italy you had at the same time the highest and the lowest level of death and of figures, because you had the highest level in some provinces in northern Italy, with New York City, maybe the toughest part of the world, the true epicenter of the pandemic in the world. And at the same time, we had the entire south of the country almost without any problem. So how is it possible to reach a common set of rules for a country which has such a different set of problems? That was the main problem. So we were obliged to apply the toughest rules because of Lombardy, but that created a lot of anxiety, a lot of problems also in the south, because south was without any problem. And that is one of the problems also, the economic recession, because the south was blocked, stopped, even if the south was without any big problem. So it is a very complicated issue. The Italian people reacted in a very, I think we surprised ourselves, first of all, because we were very good in obeying the rules, in applying the rules without big problems. That was not the case in other European countries. Italy, I think, was one of the best in the application of rules. Now, of course, there's some People are tired, and first of all, people want to start again with the economic activities, because also we understood that 2 months of lockdown for the country, it was a bill of 100 billion euros, and 100 billion euros is enormous. It's around 7-8% of the Italian GDP. So now the big problem is the recession, and the big problem is the way in which this recession will be managed. But of course, 2 months ago, the big problem was the coffin, the sequence of the coffin. It was horrible, it was sad, it was terrible what we experienced. And we are, again, all these images in our mind. It was really a tragedy in some provinces of the country. But now there's some hope, also because the European Union just yesterday took some important decisions for the future. And we hope that these decisions can be effective and good for the restarting of Italian, French, or Spanish and European economy.
Thank you. Let me just maybe follow up and ask what you see as the long-term consequences of this for Europe, and especially for European Union. So as you mentioned, there was no competence on a European-wide basis to deal with a public health problem like the COVID started. And countries were forced in a way to respond individually by devising various methods and dealing with the illnesses. But now, so this has led to people to talk about the end of globalization, the end of creation, the re-emergence of a system that is based primarily on national interests. But then you also mentioned that there's these steps now towards creating a unified fiscal policy in Europe. Maybe that's an exaggeration, but it would be a major step that didn't happen after the 2008 recession either. So when you look at this tension, how do you see the long-term impact of this on Europe, on European Union in particular?
The European history is full of crises, and each crisis was important to have a step in the integration. That was the case also in the crisis of 2008, because of this crisis, we changed our monetary policy. Mario Draghi's quantitative easing is because of the crisis. We created a sort of European Monetary Fund, the ESM. We created a beginning of a banking union. So it's the demonstration that through crisis we can go and we can have further integration. I think this time will be the demonstration of this role once again, because this crisis is worse, and there's first of all a big difference in the reactions, because in this crisis the reaction came very quickly. That was not the case 10 years ago. 10 years ago, the European leaders, the European countries, the European institutions took 4 years between 2008 and 2012, because Mario Draghi's quantitative easing announcement was July 12. And the crisis started September 8. And the same for the ESM. The ESM started first part of 12. So 4 years of wasting time and recession, double digit. It was really a disaster. The big problem for countries like Spain, Italy, Portugal, Greece was exactly this time and this gap. That was not the case in this crisis now, because after 3 months we have a new toolbox. Yesterday it was announced. Now it is necessary to have June the 18th, the final approval of the European Council. There are some problems because there are 4 countries out of 27 with some problems. Netherlands, Austria, Sweden, and Denmark. They are not big countries, so I think at the end of the day, we will find an agreement. And maybe the most important reason in favor of an agreement is Brexit, because having the UK out limit very much the strength of these countries to put a veto or to stop everything, because the UK was, of course, a big ally of this kind of attitude. At the same time, there's a second important change. It was the fact that last time during the financial crisis, the reaction of the European institutions was only a financial reaction. It was the reaction to the financial crisis. That is not the case today because the crisis is not only financial, it is a financial crisis, real economic crisis, social crisis, and public health care crisis. So I think the most important part of the response today is the creation of 2 new toolbox. One is on social response, on healthcare, this plan SURE on unemployment, the ESM utilized for healthcare renovation, and the tools for the recession of the real economy. That is, I think, the most important, the other big important part, because last time we didn't have anything. Last time, the only response at European level was a sort of financial response. The idea was the European Union is there to assure and to allow financial stability. For the rest is in the hands of member states. So now it is a big steps into a more federal union. This is why I think you're right, Reşat, when you said, fiscal union, yes, it's a big step, because when we decided yesterday to have a bond issued by the Commission all together, and we decide to use the money that we get from this bond for missions that we decide all together at the European level and at national level, that's a big step in the direction of a more federal Europe. And with this 3 levels together, social, real economy, and financial. And I think this is the key point and the most important point for the future. My guess is that this decision is an historic decision. And it's an historic decision because Germany took this decision, and Germany pushed in favor of this decision. This is a decision taken by Merkel and approved by a European Commission under the leadership of another German leader, Ursula von der Leyen. So really, Germany is protagonist. And if I may say, it is the first time after many years that Germany is leader. Germany is leading the European Union. Because in all these years, we saw, as The Economist said once, the reluctant hegemony. And it is comprehensible for many reasons. It was also because we thought that the Merkel cycle was at the end, but it is not the case, because Merkel, after the consensus figures she has now in the polls, I think she will be chancellor for the next 10 years, at least, because she's at the top in Europe in terms of reputation, in terms of support. So Germany played an important role, and if I may add some chili, some spicy, that was also because of the famous decision 15 days ago of the German Constitutional Court, because the German Constitutional Court 2 weeks ago took a decision very tough against the European Union, the European Court of Justice, the European Central Bank. It was a very anti-European decision, saying that we don't accept that the European level is stronger than national level. And that was a very, very tough decision, unexpected. And I think this decision was a sort of, when you in soccer you score a goal in your own. So it was exactly like that, because Merkel, I think she was obliged to move. She was obliged to move because this decision was had the support. The decision of the court in Germany had only the support of the nationalistic party in Germany, and out of Germany, the only two leaders supporting this decision were the Prime Minister of Hungary and the Prime Minister of Poland. So it was unacceptable for Germany to be pushed in this constituency. And I think for Merkel, it was also the opportunity to say, okay, now we take as an historic decision. I think it is not very different from what Helmut Kohl did in the 90s, when Helmut Kohl decided to take very important decisions in sharing currency and other important steps of the European integration. So I think yesterday, I tweeted, the European Union is becoming adult. And I'm really, I do think that the European Union is becoming adult in this decision, because it is the worst crisis ever, because people are suffering in Europe, and because without such a decision, it would be possible a political disaster in Europe, with populists taking the lead and many other Brexits. And yesterday's decision, I think it's a very important step in the right direction.
Well, let me ask you then. I mean, this is a very clear direction that you point out: a stronger, more unified Europe, and obviously a Europe strengthened like that will interact with other powers on the global scene. How do you see Europe's position now towards more integration, less national power, if you will, coexisting, interacting, competing with China and the United States, obviously? How do you see these three units now interacting with each other in this new world?
That's a good question. China and Russia played an important role within the European Union during the crisis. Mm-hmm. And in Italy, first of all, because in the first days of the crisis, where we had a big intervention with big propaganda method also from Russia and from China, they helped us. It was good, of course, with sanitary masks, with some help, some concrete help. In the same period in which the European Union at the very beginning was not understanding how deep was the crisis. So the consequence was we had some polls in which the Italians, they said, Russia and China are our best friends, and Germany and France are our worst enemies. That was the reaction in the very days of the crisis. But then I think the situation has changed. But the key point is that China is playing a game, is playing a role. China was at the very beginning the reason of the crisis. Then China is trying to play a role. China is trying to relaunch herself in a more effective way. I think Russia now is entering a very complicated period for the pandemic, so I don't think Russia will have very easy days. I was a little bit shocked by the way in which the US entered the crisis and managed the crisis, but I think it would be my turn to ask you what is happening in the US and in Washington State and the western part of the US. But if I may say, the crisis underlined the collapse of the transatlantic community. Because frankly speaking, we never had any form of cooperation among the three pillars of the transatlantic community: the UK, the European Union, and the US. No cooperation at all. It was not the idea or the sense to try to lead together the crisis. And I think it is the first time in our modern history in which the transatlantic community is not leading the response to anything. And I think it in the agenda of the post-crisis, one of the first points of the agenda is how to rebuild a transatlantic community, because the transatlantic community is no more there. Of course, the elections, November elections in the US will play a role, because it is one thing is to rebuild this transatlantic community in the continuity with the last 4 years. Another thing is to work with Joe Biden, of course. But I mentioned this point because it's one of the crucial points. And also because this point and the elections will have some consequences in the relationship between Europe and China. I have to say very frankly, I think the rapprochement between China and the European Union in the last years is also because of Trump. Trump played a role in pushing China and Europe to be closer and closer, with this approach very antagonistic against Europe on protectionism, on the military side, on many other issues, climate change, Paris conference, and so on. All these attitudes were perceived as aggressive attitudes. In the same period, China had a very positive attitude towards Europe on the multilateral system. For instance, I think one of the crucial decisions was when, in the same period, Trump decided to get out from Paris climate change agreement, and at the same time, Xi Jinping decided to relaunch and to be there and to push the rest of the world to stay and to relaunch multilateralism. That played a big role for the relationship between the European Union and China. So, to answer your question, I have to say that the post-COVID will be interesting to understand which kind of relationship among these three big powers. A European Union more integrated. My guess is that the European Union, if more integrated, will play a role to try to avoid a new Cold War between the US and China. We'll try to work to stabilize, to create more dialogue, to relaunch the multilateral system. You know, the multilateralism is the big victim in political terms of COVID-19, because if I think what happened 10 years ago, it was the creation of the G20 at prime minister level, and my experience was the G20 was one of the most useful and interesting tools and framework. And it was a creation in the US, a bipartisan creation, because it was the last year of Bush and first year of Obama, and they worked together on that point. And the G20 was a very important consequence in terms of restoring or relaunching multilateralism after the crisis. The G7 played a role, a crucial role. I can testify, I can remember the role that Obama played to push the Europeans to be all together. The G7 meetings were the place where Obama pushed Merkel to be more courageous, and to be more open to France and Italy in terms of finding solutions to the crisis. So the G7 played a role. Now, in this year 2020, where you have the G7 under Trump leadership and the G20 under MBS leadership, they are both missing in action. And we had a crisis without multilateral system working. At the end of the day, the only multilateral system working is the European Union. And it is not a good news. I think it is a very bad news. So the relaunch of an effective multilateralism will be the other big point in the agenda of the post-crisis.
So I want to turn now a little bit towards your current position as Dean of Paris School of International Affairs. So obviously, we are leading higher education institutions, and we do have a special responsibility now to train our students, to prepare them for this world that is changing in such unpredictable ways. So how do you see the role that our institutions can play in both preparing our students, but also perhaps in contributing to the creation of a multilateral world that you hope that will emerge afterwards?
I think we have to fight. We have to fight because the wind is against us today. Working to push people, young people, to work for multilateralism, to stand for multilateralism, to invest their own life in a multilateral job is not easy today. So we have to fight. We have to stand. At the same time, I think we have to renew our offer because there are many changes in the world and many changes also in the way in which multilateralism is and the different issues are. For instance, I think that our school and our schools there's one of the main goals is to train diplomats, for instance. And I think foreign policy and multilateral foreign policy is changing, and like all the civil servant activities are changing. For instance, one of the topics we are trying to address the most today is how to give our students both a social sciences background and some hard sciences background together. Because we think that we are entering a world in which many issues are issues where you have to combine competences. Maybe it is impossible because it's impossible to be lawyer and computer scientist together at the same time. But you can be someone involved in social sciences, having in mind some compass, some cardinal points of the compass of science and technology, and the opposite. And I think it's crucial because there are so many subjects for the future civil servant activity. I mentioned 3: data protection management, and artificial intelligence, climate change, pandemic, where you immediately understand that it is impossible to leave everything to the lawyers or to leave everything to people experts in sociology or only to people experts in computing, or it's not working. You need to combine, and Our big effort today is to find a way to combine. So that is the first point. The other point is the challenge. I know you are facing the same challenge of the pandemic, the online courses, and the social distancing. It's not easy because the experience of being part of a community is a big part of the pedagogic offer we have. The activities, the exchanges. And I have to say also teaching remotely is not the same experience. And I prefer to teach not remotely because you can understand what students are understanding. That is not the case in online activities. At the same time, with the online activities, you can have opportunities that would be impossible to have without the online activities. For instance, we are having a course that I like very much. Is a course on Brexit negotiations, where I put together one UK negotiator, one European negotiator together, and for students to have the possibility to listen and to compare the different point of views in the same moment, thanks to the online activities. It is a big asset. It's a big plus for them. And the same for an activity that we decided to create on economic diplomacy, and activities that we are running together with San Diego, with Seoul, and with Montreal, and in the frame of the OECD. It is fantastic for students, possibility to have an Asian point of view, an American point of view, a Canadian point of view, an European point of view, and the OECD as framework. And it is easiest to do so with the online activities. It would be almost impossible without big money in physical presence. So I think it's a very challenging period. For us, it's a big challenge because in Paris we have, in our school, in the School of International Affairs, we have 700 students per year, so 1,400 in total, and 40% of them are not Europeans, 40%. 30% are French, and other 30% are from the rest of Europe. So diversity, it's a great asset. But at the same time, it's not easy to have, but I think for you it's the same, to have courses, online courses, when you have such a time zone, so different time zones. So it's not easy because you have, in Paris, you have just from 3 to 5 o'clock in the afternoon to get the Americans and people from Asia. But you can't have all courses at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock. It's not manageable. So I think this crisis will change forever the way in which we teach. This is my feeling. We will come back to the courses, normal courses, but I think we will add some online teaching that will be not the center of our activity, but it would be very, very useful, very interesting, that can bring to the students something more. And that is a sort of it's a complement to the rest of the activity, and it is the way also to give students more opportunities. So I think we have to be very cautious in this very period, but also very courageous to try to be open to all this news, and to be and to follow what students are thinking, what is their reaction in this very period, because it is clear that they are suffering, they are asking themselves, they are surprised, and I think their help will be decisive.
I want to remind our audience to, you can write your questions and we will try to get to them. There is one question, it's a detail. Could you clarify what exactly the German Constitutional Court decided that you mentioned? Can you describe that?
Yeah, 2 weeks ago, the Constitutional Court in Germany was supposed to take a decision on what Mario Draghi did in the quantitative easing decisions 5 years ago. So it was not on this crisis, but the sentence was on Mario Draghi's quantitative easing. So the new monetary policy of the European Central Bank, more proactive, more close to the Fed, if I may say. So very with an expansionistic monetary policy. And the decision of the Constitutional Court was, first of all, it was very tough against the European Court of Justice, saying in terms of principle, we decide, and we are not at your disposal. That was this part of the sentence is very tough, very tough. And then saying to the Bundesbank, so the German central bank, who is today part of the ECB, not to continue monetary policy, not to being part of this monetary policy without some conditions. And these conditions were extraordinary crisis. So the idea was not to give the possibility to this quantitative easing to work in an ordinary period. The Constitutional Court said to the Bundesbank, you can be in a quantitative easing monetary policy only in an extraordinary crisis, time of crisis. So this sentence was not creating problem for this period, this very period, because it is impossible to say it is not a period of extraordinary crisis. It is. But it was supposed to be a big problem for the future. And at the same time, this attack to the European Court of Justice was a very, very negative step, because it allowed immediately the Hungarian Constitutional Court, the Polish Constitutional Court, to do the same and to start with the really disgregation of the European Union. So it was really a turning point. I think the toughest decision of the German Constitutional Court against the European Union. And I repeat, it was all the parties in Germany, but the nationalistic AfD party took a position against what the Constitutional Court decided. Even CDU, even Schäuble was the champion of the austerity. Schäuble was the Minister of Finance of Germany during previous crisis. And he was really the champion of austerity. He was the one who was toughest, really. He applied very, very tough measures against Greece. But now he decided to be on the side of the European Union. So he said it's not a good decision. It is negative for Germany. So this sentence was very important in the debate within the European countries and within Germany.
So there are several questions that talk about climate change. And I guess I can summarize this by asking you if you think this period of change that we're going through will make it easier for an entity like the European Union to follow like a green diplomacy, a diplomacy that kind of fosters collaboration for this common problem of climate change.
That was one of the main topics in the Brussels debate in the last days. And yesterday, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, when she presented the recovery plan, with this name EU Next Generation. She was very brave, I think, by linking this plan to the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal is probably the flagship of this European Commission. Is the flagship of this European Commission because it was the most important project that von der Leyen presented at the very beginning of this legislature. She started her work in last autumn, just before Christmas, and the Green New Deal, this big plan of investment and change of the European economy in a green way. It was the flagship. So the first idea, the first risk was Green New Deal will be one of the victims of COVID-19, because now everything will be completely changed. Priorities are different, and so she was good by linking both and by saying that recovery plan, we will put a lot of money there, but it is not just a way to assist countries and people in difficulty because of the crisis. It's a comprehensive relaunch of the European economy, so it has to be linked with the Green New Deal. And I think she was right. And of course, now it's not easy to be compliant with this decision, and it will be not easy. But her goodwill is there, and also the political goodwill is there. So I think there's a big opportunity, and it depends on the way in which different countries will apply, but I'm quite optimistic on that.
So there is a question about the right-wing populism. Of course, this has been a topic now in Europe for a while. How do you think the COVID-19 is affecting the right-wing populism?
In some countries, like France and Italy, for instance, or Spain, you have this very strange contradiction, because in the polls you have a rise of Euroscepticism during this crisis and a decrease of sovereignist parties. That seems to be a contradiction, but I think it is comprehensible. People at the very beginning were very Eurosceptic because they saw the European Union not immediately reacting, but the European Union was not immediately reacting for the reason I mentioned at the very beginning, that the European Union was not competent at all. And that is the complexity of this institutional architecture. At the same time, the populist leaders were so bad in their communication. They were pushing and generating anxiety in a moment in which people don't want anxiety. People want to be reassured. And so you had at the European level a trend that was everywhere, the increase of the support for ruling parties and for governments in all the different countries. Spain and France, a little bit more problematic because of the big division there's there in the system, but everywhere you have this trend. But the game is always open, if I may say, because the decisions that the European Commission took yesterday are decisions with not an immediate application. And we have now 55 million unemployed workers created by the crisis in the last 3 months in Europe. And these people will get some subsidies at the very beginning in these months, but we need responses, structural responses in the further months. Without that, if we need to wait too much, I think it will be very easy for populist parties to get new consensus. And I'm afraid that game is not over with them, because the crisis will be a very deep social crisis. And when you have deep social crisis, you have always the rise of populism, because people are scared, people are afraid for the future of their children. And I think it will be the case now. So now they are in difficulty, but I think they will be still there. And the two countries where they are strongest, they are France and Italy, because Marine Le Pen in France will be the candidate to be president of the Republic in 2022. And I think it will be again Macron-Le Pen in the second turn. And I think Macron can win, but is not given for granted. And the same in Italy, where government is working well, but the weakness of the majority is still there. And the strength of populists is still there, and Euroscepticism is still there. So game is not over, even if they are in some difficulties.
So we are coming to the end of our time, but there's one more question I want to ask. This is again from one of our from the audience. This talks about Europe's role in other parts of the world. I mean, given this tremendous big crisis that Europe has to deal with now internally, what will that do to European help to other developing countries, NGOs? So the global role of Europe, do you see that? Do you see a change in that?
That's a very good question, because if I follow my experience last time, so 10 years ago, I remember that the European Union, with such a crisis, had an inward-looking reaction. That means that, for instance, the European Council meeting I attended were in the period 13-14, were meetings where 99% of the time of the meetings was dedicated to domestic issues, European issues. And at the end, the last 20 minutes of 2 days meeting, it was a sort of tour d'horizon of the rest of the world. That was the feeling, because the crisis was the deepest ever at that time. And this inward-looking approach was the reaction. So I'm afraid that something similar could happen again. And I hope not, of course, because it is very negative. And I hope that European leaders can be more, I would say, wise to consider that the world today is different from 10 years ago. Interdependence is today more and more the rule of the game. And the need to be player at the world level is absolutely there. So I hope leaders will be able not to leave the European Union only focused on an inward-looking approach, because there are many issues. Africa was one of the good topics that Ursula von der Leyen presented as another flagship for the Commission, to say it will be the legislature, the European legislature, with Africa in the priorities. And I hope that will be like that. But I repeat, I'm a little bit afraid that the experience of 10 years ago can be repeated.
So, do you, I mean, we just have 4 minutes left. I just wanted to just raise one question, maybe just, it seems to me that one of the big challenges will be to restore trust in international organizations. This is European Union in Europe, and of course federal government in the United States and its relationships with the rest of the world. How do you see that happening? I mean, what would be a good way of restoring that trust? Because without that, it would be very hard to support the kinds of institutions that we will need to build. I mean, this is a big question, but maybe we can end with some optimistic notes about this.
For Europe, the key point will be the effectiveness in the response to the crisis, because it is clear that the European Union engaged herself to be part of this response. So now it is decisive to get solutions. At world level, I think the transatlantic relationship will be one of the key issues, and depends on the states, of course, first of all. But in my view, it is a crucial issue, and world will be different without an effective transatlantic leadership. And that means, I repeat, next American elections will be the most important election in the decade, probably. And at the same time, I think at WTO level, there's another big topic. Because WTO is almost dead, but we have to think how to relaunch a multilateral trade system. Otherwise, you will have the, I would say, the rule of the jungle leading the decisions, and it's not good. It's not good. So I think that is the other key point. I always hope the UN can relaunch themselves and take a leadership on some issues. But at the end of the day, my answer will bring me to say that the most important issue is climate change for the relationship between multilateralism and the people in our societies. Because if we find good solutions in Glasgow and in the next COP on global climate change issues, then I think people will have more trust and will be more confident in multilateralism.
Enrico, I want to thank you for your generosity, and this has been very illuminating for all of us. Thank you for taking the time with the time difference, and I look forward to seeing you in person before too long, I hope. Thank you. And thank you
so much. Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure. I hope to visit Seattle as soon as possible.
Look forward to it. And thank you everybody for joining. And this is the end of our live stream. Thank you.